A mother's love is a dangerous thing, but a desperate mother is a force of nature. In the winter of 1888, amidst the brutal Wyoming Badlands, a woman walked out of the snow with death on her heels. She didn't ask for money. She didn't ask for mercy. She looked a stranger in the eye and made the ultimate sacrifice: take my children. She thought it was the end. She didn't know she had just knocked on the door of the only man dangerous enough to save them all. This isn't a fairy tale. This is the brutal, untold true story of the Broken Creek standoff. Buckle up. The Absaroka Range, Wyoming Territory. Date: November 1888. Wyoming didn't just get cold in November. It tried to kill you. The wind coming down off the Absaroka Mountains wasn't air. It was a physical weight, a wall of ice that stripped the heat from a man's marrow. Silas Thorne pulled the collar of his buffalo coat tighter, though it did little good. At 42, Silas felt 60. He was a man etched by hard years, with a face like cracked leather, and eyes that had seen too much of the worst parts of humanity. He was checking the northern fence line of the Broken Creek Ranch, a patch of dirt that was technically his, though the bank in Cheyenne held the paper, and the local land baron, Baron Sterling, held the grudge. His horse, a roan mare named Whiskey, pinned her ears back and snorted, dancing sideways. "Easy, girl." Silas grunted, his voice rough from disuse. He lived alone, and words were expensive. He squinted into the whiteout. The snow was falling so thick he could barely see the fence posts he'd driven into the frozen earth 3 years ago. But something was wrong. A shape, dark and jagged, broke the endless white monotony about 50 yards out. A fallen calf? A wolf? Silas drew the Winchester from its leather scabbard, a reflex born of the war and the lawless years that followed. He nudged Whiskey forward. The wind howled, screaming like a banshee, drowning out the crunch of hooves on snow. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself. It wasn't an animal. It was a wagon, or what was left of one. One wheel was shattered. The axle snapped like a dry twig, leaving the bed listed heavily to the left. The canvas cover was shredded, flapping violently in the gale. There were no horses. They had likely been cut loose or died miles back. Silas holstered the rifle. Anyone out here was dead. The temperature had dropped to 20 below zero last night. He rode up alongside the wreck, intending to check for bodies and bury them before the coyotes came. He dismounted, his boots sinking into drift. He reached for the canvas flap. "Stay back." The voice was weak, brittle as ice, but fierce. Silas froze. A barrel of a rusty Colt Navy revolver poked through the tear in the canvas. It was shaking violently. "Ma'am," Silas said, raising his gloved hands, "I ain't no road agent. You're on my land." The canvas was ripped aside. The woman who stared out at him looked like a specter. Her skin was gray, her lips blue and cracked. Her eyes were sunken, dark hollows in a skeletal face, but they burned with a terrifying, feverish light. She couldn't have been more than 30, but the West had aged her. She wore a thin wool coat that was threadbare at the elbows, wrapped around her like a shroud. Behind her, huddled under a pile of dirty quilts, were 2 lumps. Small lumps. "I have no money," she rattled out, the gun wavering. "I have nothing." "I don't want your money," Silas said, stepping closer. He saw the frostbite blackening the tips of her fingers where they gripped the gun. "You're freezing to death. You need a fire." "We need food," she whispered. The gun lowered. Her strength was failing. Silas looked past her. A boy, maybe 8 years old, pale as the snow, stared back with wide, terrified eyes. Beside him, a smaller girl, perhaps 5, was motionless. "Is the girl alive?" Silas asked sharply. The woman turned, panic flaring. She shook the girl. "Bess? Bess, wake up!" The girl didn't move. The woman turned back to Silas, and the defiance shattered. The gun fell from her hand into the snow. She scrambled forward, nearly falling out of the wagon, grabbing the lapels of Silas's coat with a grip that felt like iron claws. "Take them," she begged. Her voice broke into a sob that the wind tore away. "Take my babies. They're good children. Caleb works hard. He can mend fences. Bess, she eats little. Please, just take them. Let them live." Silas stared down at her. He had seen desperation before. He had seen men beg for their lives at the end of a rope. But this was different. This was a woman negotiating her own death for the survival of her blood. She was offering to die here, in the snow, if he would just put the children on his horse. "I ain't running an orphanage, lady," Silas said, his voice hard. The hope in her eyes died, replaced by a vast, crushing despair. She slumped against the wagon wheel. "Then kill us. It's kinder than the cold." Silas looked at the boy, Caleb. The kid was shivering so hard his teeth clicked audibly. He looked at the woman, Margaret, he would learn later. Margaret O'Connell. Silas swore under his breath. He grabbed the woman by the waist and hoisted her up. She was light, terrifyingly light. Nothing but bird bones and grief. "I said, I ain't running an orphanage," Silas growled, swinging her up onto the back of his saddle. "And I ain't running a graveyard neither." He marched to the back of the wagon and scooped up the boy. "Can you hold your sister?" "Yes, sir," Caleb stammered. Silas grabbed the girl. She was barely breathing, her skin cold to the touch. He shoved the girl into the boy's arms, then lifted them both, placing them in front of the woman on the saddle. "Hold them," Silas commanded the woman. "If you let go, they fall. If they fall, they die. You understand?" "I understand," she whispered, wrapping her frozen arms around her children. "What about you?" the boy asked, his voice small. Silas took the reins of the horse. "I walk." "But," the woman started, "I said take the children." Silas looked her dead in the eye. Starving widow said, "Take my children." Poor rancher answered, "I'll take you too. Now shut your mouth and keep them warm." He turned his back to the wind, grabbed the bridle, and began the 3-mile trudge back to the cabin. He didn't know it yet, but he wasn't just carrying 3 half-dead strangers. He was carrying a war to his doorstep. The cabin at Broken Creek wasn't much. It was built of rough-hewn logs, chinked with mud and straw. It had a single room, a stone hearth, and a loft where Silas slept. It smelled of wood smoke, cured tobacco, and loneliness. But to Margaret O'Connell, it was a palace. Silas kicked the door shut against the blizzard, sealing them in the dim warmth. He wasted no time. He stripped the wet coats off the children, wrapping them in his own blankets. Scratchy wool that smelled of horse, but held heat. He laid them on the bearskin rug before the fire. "Don't put them too close," he warned Margaret as she fussed over them. "Heat 'em up too fast. Their hearts will stop. It's the chilblains you gotta watch for." He went to the cast-iron stove in the corner. His pantry was pathetic. A sack of flour, some dried beans, a slab of salt pork, and half a jar of coffee. He lived on the edge of starvation himself, every penny going to the banknotes. He cut a chunk of the pork, threw it in a pot with water and beans, and set it on the fire. Margaret sat on the floor, shivering uncontrollably as the thaw set in. The pain of returning circulation was agonizing. Silas poured a tin cup of black coffee and handed it to her. "Drink. It's hot." She took it with shaking hands. "Thank you. Mr. Thorne. Silas Thorne. I'm Margaret. This is Caleb and Bess." Silas nodded, watching her. Now that the wind wasn't stinging his eyes, he looked closer. She was a handsome woman, or would be with 20 pounds of meat on her bones. She had high cheekbones and hair the color of polished copper, currently matted and wet. But he saw something else. As she raised the cup to her lips, her sleeve slipped down. Around her wrist, dark purple and yellow against the pale skin, was a bruise. It was perfectly shaped, the imprint of a large hand, squeezing hard enough to crush. Silas looked at the boy. Caleb had a cut above his eye that was healing poorly. "That wagon didn't break itself," Silas said quietly, stirring the beans. Margaret froze. She pulled her sleeve down quickly. "The trail, it was rough. We hit a rock." "A rock doesn't grab a woman's wrist," Silas said, not looking at her. "And a rock doesn't make a boy look over his shoulder every time the wind rattles the door." "We are grateful for the food, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice hardening. "We won't be a burden. As soon as the storm passes, we will leave." "On foot?" Silas scoffed. "Without a horse? You'd make it to the creek before you froze. You're stuck here, Mrs. O'Connell, at least until the pass clears, which gives us about 3 days." The little girl, Bess, stirred. She sat up, groggy. "Mama, I'm hungry." Silas ladled out the bean soup into 3 wooden bowls. It was watery, but the fat from the pork glistened on top. He handed them to the family. They didn't eat, they devoured. The boy ate with a ferocity that made Silas's stomach turn. They hadn't eaten in days. Silas took his own portion, smaller than theirs, and leaned against the wall, eating while standing. "Where's your husband?" Silas asked bluntly. Margaret flinched. The spoon clattered against her bowl. "Dead." "Sickness?" "Accident," she said. The lie was so thin Silas could see right through it. "Mining accident. In the Black Hills." "Long way from the Black Hills to here," Silas mused, "especially for a widow with no money. We were heading to Oregon. I have kin there." "Through this pass? In November?" Silas shook his head. "You aren't heading to something, Mrs. O'Connell. You're running from something." Margaret put her bowl down. She pulled her children closer. "If we are a danger to you, say so. Give us a gun, and we will go to the barn. I won't bring trouble to your house." Silas looked at the fire. He thought about the emptiness of this cabin. He thought about the grave behind the house. His wife, dead 10 years now from smallpox. He thought about the silence that usually filled his evenings. "Trouble's already here," Silas said. "Baron Sterling's men were seen on the ridge 2 days ago. If you're running from the law, I'll turn you in myself. I ain't harboring fugitives." "Not the law," Margaret said, her voice trembling with a sudden raw intensity. "We aren't criminals. My husband Patrick, he was a good man." "Patrick?" Silas felt a jolt. "Patrick O'Connell? Big Irishman? Scar through his eyebrow?" Margaret's eyes went wide. "You knew him?" Silas set his bowl down. The past, it seemed, had a way of walking through the door just when you thought you'd buried it. "Knew him. I rode with him. In the 7th Cavalry, before the wars turned sour." "He never mentioned to Silas," she whispered. "He wouldn't. We didn't part as friends." Silas walked to the window, peering out into the black storm. "Patrick was a stubborn fool, but he was honest. If he's dead, and you've got bruises on your wrists, and you're running through a blizzard, someone killed him." Margaret didn't answer. Her silence was a confession. "Who was it?" Silas asked. "You can't help us," she said softly. "The man who is after us owns this territory, or he thinks he does." "Name him." "Sterling," she whispered. "Baron Sterling." Silas laughed, a dry, bitter sound. "Well, isn't that a fine coincidence? I owe Sterling $300 by spring, or he takes this ranch. Seems we have a mutual acquaintance." Suddenly, the dog on the porch, a ragged mongrel named Buster, started barking. A low, guttural growl that turned into a frenzy. Silas moved instantly. He doused the oil lamp, plunging the room into the orange glow of the dying fire. He grabbed the Winchester. "Get in the loft," he hissed to Margaret. "Take the kids. Hide under the hay. Don't make a sound." "Is it him?" Caleb asked, his voice high with terror. "Go," Silas ordered. He watched them scramble up the ladder. He waited by the door, listening. The storm was loud, but over the wind, he heard it. The heavy thud of horses. Not one, 6 or 7. Silas cracked the shutter. Lanterns bobbed in the darkness. They were surrounding the cabin. A voice boomed out, familiar and oily. It was Deputy Halloway, a man who wore a badge but took his orders from Baron Sterling's wallet. "Silas Thorne, open up. We tracked a wagon to your fence line. We know you got the woman." Silas cocked the rifle. He looked up at the loft, where 3 terrified souls were holding their breath. He looked at the meager life he had built. He could open the door. He could hand them over. Sterling might even forgive the debt. It would be the smart thing to do. Silas Thorne spat on the floor. He hated doing the smart thing. "I'm coming out," Silas yelled. "Keep your hands where I can see 'em." He opened the door and stepped out into the snow, the rifle cradled in his arm. 7 men on horseback stared down at him. Halloway smiled, his gold tooth glinting in the lantern light. "Evening, Silas. Cold night for company." "I ain't got company," Silas lied. "Found a wagon. Empty. Reckon the occupants walked off a cliff." Halloway leaned down. "Now, Silas, don't lie to me. We saw the tracks. 2 distinct sets of footprints. And drag marks? Did you carry them, Silas? A cripple like you?" "Get off my land, Halloway." "Give us the widow and the brats, Silas," Halloway said, his voice dropping to a menace. "Sterling wants what she stole." "What did she steal?" "Something that don't belong to a dead miner's wife. A map, Silas. A map to the lost Dutchman's vein." Silas's mind raced. Gold. Patrick O'Connell had found gold. That explained the murder. That explained the hunt. "I told you," Silas said, raising the rifle slightly. "She ain't here." Halloway sighed. He pulled a torch from his saddlebag and lit it. "Have it your way. Boys, burn it down. If they ain't inside, Silas won't mind losing a shanty. If they are, well, they'll come out screaming." Halloway threw the torch. It arced through the snowy air, landing on the dry thatch of the porch roof. The fire caught instantly. The fire on the porch roof didn't roar at first. It hissed, a serpentine sound of heat meeting wet wood. But the oil from the torch was hungry, and the wind was a bellows. In seconds, the orange glow expanded, illuminating the sneering face of Deputy Halloway. Silas Thorne didn't think. He didn't weigh the moral implications of what he was about to do. He simply let the soldier inside him, the cold, mathematical killer from the wars of his youth, take the wheel. "Burn it!" Halloway shouted, turning his horse to trot back to the perimeter. "Flush 'em out!" Silas raised the Winchester. He didn't aim at Halloway. He didn't aim at the men. He aimed at the lantern hanging from the saddle of the man to Halloway's right. a nervous younger gunman named Skeeter. Crack. The rifle shot was swallowed by the wind, but the result was instant. The bullet shattered the glass globe of the lantern. Burning kerosene sprayed across the flank of Skeeter's horse. The animal screamed, a high, terrifying sound that cut through the blizzard. It bucked violently, throwing Skeeter into the snow, and bolted. It slammed sideways into Holloway's mount. Chaos erupted. Horses are herd animals. Panic is contagious. The line of 7 men broke as their mounts reared and spun in the deep drifts. "Hold them! Damn you, hold them!" Holloway screamed, fighting his reins. Silas didn't wait to watch. He spun on his heel and dove back through the cabin door, slamming the heavy bolt home just as a hail of gunfire splintered the wood where his head had been a second before. Inside, the room was filling with smoke. The fire had eaten through the roof thatch and was now gnawing at the beams. "Silas!" Margaret screamed from the loft. "Get down here! Now!" Silas roared, grabbing the heavy oak table and flipping it onto its side to create a barricade against the door. Margaret practically threw the children down the ladder before sliding down herself. She was coughing, her eyes streaming. Caleb was clutching his sister so hard his knuckles were white. "They're going to kill us," Caleb whimpered. "Not tonight, son," Silas said, his voice eerily calm. He moved to the center of the room, kicking the bearskin rug aside. Underneath, the floorboards were loose. He jammed the barrel of his rifle into a pry hole and heaved. A trapdoor, heavy and thick, groaned open. It revealed a dark, damp hole. The root cellar. "It's a dead end," Margaret cried, looking at the black pit. "If the house burns, we bake." "It connects to the creek bed," Silas said, grabbing a lantern but not lighting it. "I dug a drainage tunnel 2 years ago when the spring thaw flooded the foundation. It's tight, it's wet, and it's full of rats, but it leads outside the perimeter." The ceiling groaned. A burning beam crashed down onto the loft where they had been hiding seconds ago. Sparks showered the room like deadly confetti. "In! Bess first!" Silas ordered. Margaret shoved the girl into the hole. Caleb followed. Margaret paused, looking at Silas. "Go!" he shouted, shoving her down. Silas grabbed a heavy sack of flour from the pantry and threw it onto the flames eating the wall. It created a momentary cloud of white dust and choked the fire for a split second. Just enough time for him to grab his ammunition belt and a coil of rope. He dropped into the hole and pulled the trapdoor shut above them. The silence was sudden and oppressive. The roar of the fire was muffled by the thick earth, replaced by the sound of their own ragged breathing and the drip of water. It smelled of wet dirt, rotting potatoes, and fear. "Crawl," Silas whispered in the pitch black. "Keep your hand on the left wall. Don't stop until you feel the cold air." He pushed them forward. The tunnel was a nightmare. It was barely 3 feet wide, shored up with rotting timbers. Mud squelched under their knees. Bess was crying softly, a rhythmic, terrified sound. "Hush, baby, hush," Margaret whispered, her voice trembling. They crawled for what felt like miles, though it was likely only 50 yards. Above them, Silas could hear the dull thump-thump of the cabin collapsing. His home, his books, the only picture he had of his wife, all of it turning to ash. He felt a pang of loss so sharp it nearly stopped him, but he shoved it down. Grief was a luxury for the living. Right now, they were just surviving. Suddenly, the stale air shifted. A draft of biting cold hit their faces. "I see light," Caleb whispered. They scrambled forward. The tunnel opened up into the cut bank of Broken Creek. They spilled out into the snow, gasping for air. The wind was ferocious here, channeled by the creek bed, but the blizzard provided cover. They looked back. Up the hill, through the veil of snow, a pillar of orange flame rose into the night sky. The cabin was an inferno. Silhouettes of men on horses circled the fire, firing guns into the air, likely assuming their prey was roasting inside. "They think we're dead," Margaret breathed, shivering as the sweat on her skin began to freeze instantly. "They'll know we ain't when they sift the ashes and don't find bones," Silas said, checking his rifle. "We have until morning, maybe noon." "Where do we go?" Margaret asked. She looked at the children. They were wrapped in the blankets Silas had given them, but the cold was already gnawing at them. "They can't walk far, Silas." Silas looked north, toward the jagged peaks of the Absaroka Range. "We can't go to town. Sterling owns the Marshall. We can't go south. The plains are wide open. They'll run us down in an hour." He pointed toward the most inhospitable terrain on the horizon, Dead Man's Ridge. "We go up," Silas said. "There's an old trapper's line shack near the timberline. It's hard to get to. Horses can't make the climb in this snow. We'll have the high ground." "That's 5 miles," Margaret said, horror in her voice. "Uphill, in a blizzard." "Then we better start walking," Silas said. He scooped Bess up into his arms. She was dead weight, exhausted and freezing. "Caleb, you walk in my footprints. Margaret, you bring up the rear. Step where I step. We leave a single trail. Confuse them if they find it." They began the march. The next 4 hours were a blur of agony. The snow was knee-deep. The wind whipped ice crystals against their faces that felt like ground glass. Every step was a battle against gravity and the desire to just lie down and sleep. Silas kept them moving with the ruthlessness of a drill sergeant. When Caleb fell, Silas yanked him up. When Margaret slowed, Silas growled at her. He knew that if he showed sympathy, they would stop. And if they stopped, they died. Around 3 a.m., the terrain changed. They entered the dense pine forest at the base of the ridge. The trees broke the wind, and the silence of the winter woods settled around them. "Stop," Silas commanded. He leaned against a massive ponderosa pine, his chest heaving. He lowered Bess to the ground. She didn't wake up. "Is she—" Margaret fell to her knees, checking the girl's breath. "She's so cold." "She's alive," Silas said, though he was worried. "Hypothermia is setting in. We're close." He looked at the boy. Caleb was standing, swaying on his feet, staring at nothing. The kid was in shock. "Boy," Silas said sharply. Caleb blinked. "Sir? You did good. You kept up." Caleb nodded slowly. "My dad said the O'Connells don't quit." "Your dad was right," Silas said. He looked at Margaret. She was rubbing Bess's hands, trying to friction burn life back into them. "Let's move. The shack is just over that rise." They crested the ridge 20 minutes later. It was there, a low, squat structure made of stone and logs, half buried in a snowdrift. It looked like a tomb, but it was shelter. Silas kicked the door open. It was dark, musty, and freezing, but it was out of the wind. "Get inside. Strip the wet layers off. All of you." He shut the door and barred it with a rotting plank. They were safe. For now. But as Silas looked at the shivering family, huddled in the dark, he knew the real danger wasn't the cold. It was the reason they were running. He needed answers, and he was going to get them before the sun came up. The trapper's shack had a stone fireplace, but Silas dared not light a fire yet. Smoke would be a beacon if the storm broke. Instead, he found a stash of old, dry furs in the corner, moth-eaten buffalo robes, and beaver pelts, left by some long-dead mountain man. He piled them onto the family. The body heat of the three of them huddled together, combined with the heavy furs, began to work. The violent shivering subsided into exhaustion. Silas sat by the door, rifle across his lap, watching the gray light of dawn slowly seep through the cracks in the walls. He hadn't slept. He chewed on a piece of dried beef jerky he'd had in his pocket, his jaw aching. When Margaret finally sat up, the sun was fully up. The storm had broken, leaving the world outside blindingly white and silent. She looked at him. Her face was gaunt, her red hair a tangled mess, but her eyes were clear. "You saved us," she said softly. "I bought us time," Silas corrected. "Holloway will find the tunnel. He's a bastard, but he's a smart bastard. He'll track us. The snow covers tracks, but it also makes fresh ones easy to spot from a distance." He stood up and walked over to them. Caleb and Bess were still asleep, buried under the furs. "Now," Silas said, keeping his voice low, "tell me, and don't lie, Margaret. I burned my life down for you last night. I deserve the truth." Margaret pulled the furs tighter around her throat. She looked at her children, then back at Silas. She reached into the inner pocket of her tattered coat. Silas expected a paper, a map, a deed. Instead, she pulled out a book. It was a Bible, leather-bound, worn smooth by years of handling. The gold leaf on the cover was flaking off. "A Bible?" Silas asked, raising an eyebrow. "You think Sterling is chasing you for scripture?" "Patrick wasn't a religious man in the traditional sense," Margaret said, running her thumb over the cover. "But he was careful. When he found the vein, he knew he couldn't file a claim. Sterling has a man in the assay office. Any claim filed in this territory that shows high-yield gold gets lost, and the filer usually ends up dead. So he hid the location," Silas surmised. "He wrote it down, but not where they could find it." She opened the Bible. Silas leaned in. The pages were filled with handwritten notes in the margins. Births, deaths, prayers. It looked like any family Bible. "Look at the Psalms," she whispered. She turned to Psalm 23. "The Lord is my shepherd." Silas squinted. At first he saw nothing. Then he noticed it. Tiny, almost invisible pinpricks under specific letters. H, E, A, D. "A cipher," Silas breathed. "Patrick taught me how to read it. It's a book code," she explained. "The pinpricks spell out landmarks, distances, bearings. It leads to a canyon in the Bighorns." He called it the Iron Cathedral. Silas sat back, exhaling a cloud of mist. "The Iron Cathedral. I've heard the old-timers talk about it. Box canyon, steep walls, red rock that looks like rust. That's where it is," she said. He brought back samples. "Silas, it's not just dust. It's nuggets the size of walnuts. It's a motherlode. Enough to buy half of Wyoming. And enough to get a man killed," Silas added grimly. "Sterling came to our house," Margaret said, her voice trembling with the memory. "Patrick was outside chopping wood. They didn't even talk to him. They just shot him. From the road. Like a dog." She choked back a sob. "They tore the house apart. They were looking for a map. They ripped up the floorboards, cut open the mattresses. They didn't look at the Bible. They threw it on the floor. And you ran. I grabbed the children and the book and ran out the back while they were in the cellar. We've been running for 3 weeks." Silas looked at the Bible. It was a heavy object, heavy with blood and greed. "Does Holloway know about the book?" "He knows Patrick wrote it down. He doesn't know where, but he knows I have it." Silas stood up and paced the small shack. This changed everything. This wasn't just a rescue mission anymore. It was a treasure hunt with a death sentence attached. Sterling won't stop, Silas said. He can't. If you get to a federal marshal outside his jurisdiction, say, in Denver, and show them this, and show them the gold, Sterling hangs. I don't care about the gold, Margaret said fiercely. I want them safe. I want my children to grow up. To do that, we need to kill Sterling, Silas said. The words hung in the air. Brutal. Simple. There are 7 of them, Margaret said, and 1 of you. 7 on the mountain, Silas corrected. Sterling is likely back at his ranch, waiting for the good news. Holloway is the dog on the leash. We need to cut the leash. How? Silas walked to the window. He watched the tree line. He saw movement. A dark shape against the white snow, about a mile down. A rider. They found us, Silas said calmly. Margaret gasped, scrambling to wake the children. Don't panic, Silas said. They can't get horses up that last incline. They'll have to come on foot. That levels the field. He turned to her. Can you shoot? I can aim. I'm not fast. Silas handed her his revolver, a heavy Colt Peacemaker. You don't need to be fast. You just need to be mean. If anyone comes through that door who isn't me, you pull the trigger until it goes click. Understand? Where are you going? She asked, clutching the gun. I'm going to go hunting, Silas said. He checked the Winchester. He had 12 rounds left. Holloway thinks he's tracking a frightened woman and a crippled farmer. He thinks we're prey. Silas opened the door, the bright sun reflecting off the snow blindingly. He pulled his hat low. I'm going to show him the difference between a rancher and a soldier. He stepped out into the cold. He didn't head away from the pursuers. He headed down the slope, into the trees, toward them. Silence in the high country is heavy. It presses against the eardrums, a physical weight made of ice and thin air. The storm had left behind a world scrubbed clean, a white canvas where every shadow looked like a man and every snapping twig sounded like a gunshot. Silas Thorne moved through this silence, not as a rancher, but as the thing he had been 20 years ago, a scout. He didn't walk. He flowed. He kept to the tree wells, where the snow was shallower, and the branches of the Douglas firs provided a canopy against the glare of the sun. He wore his white long johns over his trousers and coat, a trick learned from the northern tribes to blend into the snow. From a distance, he was invisible. He found their tracks easily. They hadn't tried to hide. Why would they? They were 7 armed men hunting a woman and a cripple. Arrogance was a louder footprint than a boot heel. There were 4 sets of tracks heading up the main slope. That meant Holloway had split his force. 3 had stayed back with the horses or circled wide. 4 were coming for the kill. Silas positioned himself on a rocky outcropping overlooking a narrow choke point in the trail, a spot where a fallen pine forced anyone passing to climb over it, exposing themselves. He waited. His breath misted in the air, but he breathed through his nose, slow and shallow, to keep the plume small. 10 minutes later, he heard them. Not the men, but the jingle of spurs and the heavy, labored breathing of flatlanders struggling at altitude. First came a man Silas recognized as Dutch, a hired gun from Cheyenne who favored a sawed-off shotgun. Behind him were 2 others, indistinguishable in their heavy coats and scarves. I'm telling you, they ain't up here, Dutch wheezed, pausing to lean against a tree. No wagon can make this grade. We're chasing ghosts. Holloway said he saw smoke, the second man grunted. You want to go back and tell him you quit? You know what he does to quitters. I ain't quittin', Dutch spat. I'm freezin'. There's a difference. They started moving again. They reached the fallen log. Dutch threw his leg over, his shotgun held loosely in one hand. Silas didn't fire. He let Dutch cross. He let the second man cross. He waited for the third man, the straggler. The rule of the ambush. Take the last man first. The others won't see him fall. As the third man straddled the log, Silas squeezed the trigger. Crack. The Winchester barked. The bullet took the man high in the chest. He didn't scream. The air was simply punched out of him. He fell backward into the snow, a crimson stain blooming instantly on his coat. Dutch and the second man spun around, weapons raised, panic wild in their eyes. "Where is he?" Dutch screamed, firing both barrels of his shotgun blindly into the trees. Buckshot shredded pine needles, but came nowhere near Silas. Silas worked the lever of his rifle. Clack, clack. He shifted his aim. He didn't shoot at the men this time. He shot at the heavy bank of snow resting on the overhanging branch directly above the second man. The bullet severed the branch's tension. 1,000 pounds of accumulated snow and ice collapsed. It buried the second man instantly, pinning him under a suffocating white avalanche. Dutch was alone. He scrambled back, slipping on the ice, dropping his empty shotgun. He clawed for the pistol at his belt. "Show yourself," Dutch roared, his voice cracking with terror. "Fight me like a man." Silas stood up from his cover, 50 yards away. He looked like a specter, white-clad and grim. He didn't raise his rifle. He simply watched. Dutch raised his pistol, his hand shaking so violently he couldn't align the sights. He fired 3 times. The bullets kicked up snow 10 feet to Silas's left. Silas raised his rifle slowly. He took his time. He wanted Dutch to feel the cold, inevitable nature of death. "Drop it." Silas's voice carried across the canyon, amplified by the acoustics of the rock walls. Dutch hesitated. He looked at his buried companion, then at the dead man on the log. He looked at Silas. The fight went out of him. He dropped the gun. Silas walked down the slope, keeping the rifle trained on Dutch's chest. When he reached him, he kicked the pistol away. "Where's Holloway?" Silas asked. Dutch was shivering, snot freezing on his mustache. "He stayed back. With Miller and the kid?" "Why?" "He said you'd be watching the trail. He said you were a soldier. He figured you'd ambush the lead element." A cold knot of dread tightened in Silas's stomach. Holloway had anticipated this. Holloway had sent these men as bait. "If he knew I'd act like a soldier," Silas whispered, "then he's acting like a general. He's flanking." "He sent us to make noise," Dutch stammered, eager to please. "To draw you out. He took the others up the goat path on the south ridge. He's circling behind you." Behind. Toward the shack. Toward Margaret and the children. Silas didn't hesitate. He swung the butt of his rifle around, striking Dutch in the temple. The man crumpled, unconscious, but alive. Silas didn't have time for prisoners, and he didn't have the cruelty to execute a surrendered man in cold blood. He turned and ran. The run back up the mountain was a blur of agony. His lungs burned as if he were inhaling broken glass. His legs, already tired from the night's march, screamed with lactic acid. But the image of Bess and Caleb, defenseless in that shack, drove him forward. He bypassed the trails, cutting straight up the vertical face of the ridge, clawing at roots and rocks, pulling himself up, hand over hand. He heard it when he was still a quarter-mile out, a single gunshot. It wasn't the heavy boom of a buffalo rifle or the crack of a Winchester. It was the sharp pop of a Colt Peacemaker. Margaret. Silas crested the final rise, his chest heaving, his vision spotting with exhaustion. He threw himself behind a boulder and looked at the shack. The door was hanging off its hinges. In the snow, about 10 yards from the threshold, lay a body. It was face down. It wore a duster coat. It wasn't Margaret. It was one of Sterling's men. Silas scanned the perimeter. No movement. No horses. The wind whistled through the broken door. "Margaret!" he screamed, abandoning caution. He sprinted across the open ground, rifle at his hip. He leapt over the dead body. A man named Miller shot cleanly through the neck and burst into the shack. It was empty. The furs were scattered. The table was overturned. There was blood on the floor, a small pool, freezing into a red puck. "No," Silas breathed. "No, no, no." He spun around, searching the room. Had they taken them all? A sound came from the woodpile in the corner. A small, muffled whimpering. Silas tore the wood away. Curled in a ball, wedged into the gap between the logs and the stone chimney, was Bess. She was shaking, her eyes squeezed shut, her hands over her ears. "Bess," Silas whispered, dropping his rifle and scooping her up. "I've got you. It's Silas. I've got you." She screamed when he touched her, a high, thin sound of pure terror, flailing her small fists against his chest. "It's me. Look at me." She opened her eyes. Recognition dawned, and she collapsed against him, sobbing uncontrollably. "Where is Mama?" Silas asked, smoothing her hair. "Where is Caleb?" Bess couldn't speak. She just pointed toward the door. Silas stood up, carrying the girl. He walked to the threshold. He looked out at the snow. There were tracks, boot prints, and drag marks. And there, pinned to the door frame with a hunting knife, was a piece of paper torn from a notebook. Silas pulled it free. The handwriting was elegant, almost scholarly. Holloway's hand. "Mr. Thorne, you fight well, but you can't be everywhere. I have the woman and the boy. The girl is of no use to me. You may keep her. If you want to see the others alive, bring the book, The Devil's Pulpit, noon. Come alone. If I see a rifle, I shoot the boy first. H." Silas crumpled the note in his fist. He looked at the sun. It was high in the sky. He had 1 hour. The Devil's Pulpit was a geological death trap, a granite spire jutting out over the canyon, connected to the cliffs by a narrow, icy stone bridge. There was no cover, no way to flank it. If you walked out onto the pulpit, you were exposed to the world. Holloway had chosen his ground perfectly. Silas stood at the tree line. He had hidden Bess in a hollow stump a mile back, praying she stayed put. On the flat top of the spire, 200 yards away, stood 3 figures. Holloway stood in the center. To his left, Margaret knelt in the snow, hands bound. To his right, Holloway held Caleb by the shoulder. Silas stepped out. "I'm here!" he yelled, his voice battling the wind. "Let them go, Holloway. You want the book? I have it." "Walk out here, Silas," Holloway shouted back, flashing a gold-toothed smile. "Hand me the book, and maybe I don't throw the boy off the edge." Silas began the walk across the slick stone bridge, a 500-foot drop on either side. He stopped 10 feet from the deputy. Up close, Holloway looked manic, the gold fever burning in his eyes. "The book," Holloway demanded. Silas reached into his coat and pulled out the worn leather Bible. "Let the boy go to his mother." Holloway shoved Caleb toward Margaret. "There, together. Now give it to me." Silas handed it over. Holloway snatched it, flipping pages until he found the pin-pricked cipher in Psalms. "It's all here," he muttered, triumph blazing. "Coordinates, landmarks." He looked up at Silas. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne. You've been very helpful." Holloway raised his revolver. Silas knew this was coming. A man who betrays his boss doesn't leave witnesses. "Goodbye, Silas," Holloway said, cocking the hammer. Silas didn't reach for a weapon. He looked calmly at the boy. "Caleb, duck." The boy dropped flat. Silas threw himself sideways, straight off the cliff. Holloway fired, the bullet cutting through empty air. He rushed to the edge, expecting to see a body tumbling into the abyss. But Silas hadn't fallen to his death. His gloved fingers had clamped onto the icy rim of the precipice. As Holloway leaned over, Silas swung his free hand up, driving a small skinning knife straight into the deputy's thigh. Holloway screamed, collapsing backward. The gun skittered across the ice and over the edge. The Bible flew from his hand, landing dangerously close to the drop. Silas hauled himself up, gasping for air. He walked over to Holloway, who was writhing in the snow, clutching his bleeding leg. "You missed," Silas said cold. "Wait," Holloway stammered, scrambling back. "We can share it. Half. I'll give you half. Millions, Silas." Silas looked at Margaret, then at the Bible lying in the snow. It was the cause of all this misery. It was blood money. "I don't want the gold," Silas said. He picked up the book. "No!" Holloway shrieked. "Don't!" Silas threw it. The Bible arced through the air, pages fluttering like a dying bird, before vanishing into the white mist of the gorge. Holloway let out a wail of absolute loss. "You fool! You burned the only thing that mattered. Sterling will peel the skin from your bones." "Sterling isn't here," Silas said, "and you aren't going to tell him." He cut Margaret's bonds. "Get up. We're leaving. You can't leave him," Margaret cried, looking at the wounded man. "He's got a knife in his leg and a long walk," Silas said grimly. "Let the wolves have him." They turned back toward the tree line, leaving Holloway screaming curses into the wind. But just as they reached the safety of the woods, a deep, rhythmic thrumming vibrated through the ground. Silas froze. He looked up at the ridge above them, the high ground he had abandoned. Silhouettes appeared against the sky. Not deputies, not hired guns. These were men in heavy buffalo coats riding war horses. In the center sat a man on a white stallion, a silver-tipped cane resting across his saddle. It was Baron Sterling. He hadn't stayed at the ranch. He had come to insure his investment, bringing 10 of the hardest killers in the territory. "Well, Mr. Thorne," Sterling's voice boomed down, "it seems you've disposed of my deputy, but I believe you have something of mine." Silas looked at Margaret. He looked at his rifle, which had only 6 bullets left. Sterling didn't know the map was gone, and Silas was out of tricks. The wind on the ridge whispered death. Baron Sterling sat on his white stallion, flanked by 10 hardened riflemen. Below, Silas stood before Margaret and the children, possessing only 6 bullets and a desperate plan. "The book, Mr. Thorne," Sterling demanded, his voice smooth as silver, "or the boy dies first." "The book is gone," Silas lied, gesturing to the abyss behind him. "I returned it to the earth. It killed enough men." Sterling's face darkened. He raised his hand, and 10 rifles clicked. "Then you have cost me millions. Kill them." "Wait," Silas roared. "I read it before I threw it. I have a memory for terrain, Sterling. I know where the Iron Cathedral is. The map is in my head." Greed paused Sterling's hand. He offered a trade, the family's safety in exchange for the gold. Silas agreed. On one condition, they had to walk away first. Silas turned to Margaret. Her eyes were wide with terror. "Go," he whispered. "Don't look back. Live for them." She stumbled away, clutching Caleb and Bess, disappearing into the tree line. Silas stood alone against an army. He knew he wasn't leaving this mountain alive. He was trading his life for minutes. "Lead on, Scout," Sterling commanded. Silas mounted a riderless horse, but he didn't turn toward the canyon. He kicked the beast's flanks, rearing it up and charging straight up the steep embankment, directly toward the massive, unstable snow cornice hanging above them. "Stop him!" Sterling shouted. Bullets whizzed past Silas. One struck his shoulder, but he held on. He raised his Winchester, aiming not at the men, but at the stress fracture in the ice shelf. Bang, bang, bang. The mountain groaned. The cornice gave way. A tidal wave of white death, thousands of tons of snow and rock collapsed onto the ridge. Sterling screamed as the avalanche swallowed him and his men whole. Silas, caught in the shock wave, was swept away into the churning darkness. When the silence returned, Margaret ran back, clawing frantically at the debris field. She dug until her hands bled. Finally, she saw a hand reaching out of the snow. She pulled Silas free, blue and broken, but breathing. "Did I get 'em?" he wheezed. "You buried them, Silas," she sobbed. "You buried them all." Baron Sterling was never seen again, entombed forever in the ice. Silas lost 2 toes to frostbite and walked with a limp. But he lived. He and Margaret never went back for the gold. They claimed the land, built a ranch, and raised the children. Caleb became a sheriff. Bess became a teacher. Silas and Margaret never married on paper, but they shared a porch and a life until the end of their days. Years later, inside Silas's bedside Bible, they found a note written in the margin of Psalm 23. "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. For I have found the only treasure worth keeping." Beneath it were 3 names: Margaret, Caleb, Bess. The starving widow had said, "Take my children." The poor rancher answered, "I'll take you too." And he kept his word. And that is the legend of the Broken Creek standoff. You won't find Silas Thorne in the history books. But out here, the truth isn't always what's written down. Sometimes, the truth is just a promise kept in the dead of winter. Sterling died for gold, but Silas lived for something worth much more. If you felt the cold of the Wyoming wind in this story, hit that like button. It helps keep the fire burning. Subscribe so you don't miss the next tale from the frontier. And tell me in the comments, would you have thrown the map? Until next time, keep your powder dry. Thanks for watching.